And hello, everyone. I am John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. And this morning, Monday morning, 11 a.m. here on the East Coast, we are proceeding with our reading of a large portion, maybe not all the book, but a large portion of the book by Anton Chaitkin called Who We Are, America's Fight for Universal Progress from Franklin to Kennedy. That's Benjamin Franklin to John F. Kennedy. And this is our beginning of the book. We are now at chapter 6, and we have just been last week talking about how Thomas Jefferson, one of the great champions of human rights and civil rights generally, at least thought of that way, but how hypocritical of him to sit on his Monticello, his hill. Beautiful, beautiful place. You should visit. If you haven't, called Monticello. And he had hundreds of slaves. Some people say as many as 600, surrounded by his Randolph cousins and other ruling gentry, trying to oppose what Hamilton was trying to do. In other words, did we want to have a national government that was powerful, or did we just want it to be a kind of a collection of states that would sometimes work together and would hopefully be able to defend themselves if attacked? But Hamilton saw that some type of financial um, basis needed to be laid for the country to survive after the revolution. And this points to the great discrepancy, the great division in our country and and our economy between what you might call the agriculturalists and the industrialists. And Jefferson, of course, is an agriculturalist, and he shows that in his opposition to Hamilton's plans. So, with that little introduction, let's get started on page 127 of Anton Chaitkin's newest book. The attack begins. Hamilton presented his report on public credit, and that's a huge volume that I haven't read, but it's the key to understanding the details of Hamilton's plan. If you want to learn more, please do look that up. The report on public credit, published on January 9th, 1790. Congress began debating it the following month. Hamilton was astonished when Madison, formerly his nationalist partner, rose on February 11th to denounce his plan, thereafter acting to block its congressional passage. Madison's attack on the Hamilton credit plan would prove to be the opening shot in a factional war led by plantation slave owners against the Washington administration's program for American economic sovereignty and industrialization. Shocked at this turn of events, Hamilton soldiered on, presenting his plan for saving the United States. He proposed to trade all outstanding debts of the national and state governments, those held in foreign countries and at home, for new federal notes at a lower interest rate. He would provide for payment on the debt with import duties and other taxes, and the use of postal service revenue. When the new notes became due, they could be traded for another issue of new notes. The debt would thereby thus be funded and useful as capital rather than being paid off and extinguished right away. See what he's doing there? He's creating a perpetual source of financing through money that can, uh, although expires, can be renewed with new notes. And this is kind of an innovation in finance. So a lot of people might not have even considered the idea of keeping these notes going perpetually, but that was his idea. Okay, continuing page 128. The government would intervene in the market to keep its notes close to par value. The notes would circulate as money to supplement and largely take the place of gold and silver, thus establishing a national currency. Sound national credit, ample cash circulation, and protective tariffs would encourage manufacturers and other enterprises and rescue the country from the hands of global bankers and speculators. Hamilton's plan was divided into three legislative initiatives: redeeming federal bond debt, assuming state debts as federal, and taxation. And the report on public credit promised a follow up proposal for a national bank to be delivered to the same session of Congress. In his attack, Madison did not pose the issue of a clash of two visions for the national future, the great industrial republic versus the small rural semi colony. He never addressed Hamilton's overall development proposal. Instead, he threw a populist smoke bomb, reviling the debt plan as a betrayal of the poor to help the rich. He attacked debt payment at full face value to the current bondholders, who in many cases had bought them at a discount from the original holders desperate for cash. Madison proposed discrimination between bondholders, to pay current holders only part of the bond's current value and to give the remainder to the original holders, along with any future value increases. That sounds fair, doesn't it? I mean, if you were a Continental soldier with a piece of paper in your hand, some script for the that had devalued to the point that it's worthless, and if you had then given it to some investor for maybe 10% of its value or 20% of its face value, that's not just. That's not what our soldiers deserved. So Madison was standing up here for them, saying, no, you should give them back the money that they should have got if these notes had been properly valued in the first place. Well, that's Madison's attack. He disregarded Hamilton's detailed explanation of the complete impracticability of finding the original holders of the various depreciated notes and assigning them appropriate payments. He said nothing to refute the report's insistence on the global strategic importance of the U.S. government fully honoring its financial obligations by making its securities worth exactly their stated value. So does that make sense? It makes sense to me that the government is going to intervene as necessary to make sure that the notes that it is promoting maintain a constant value and thereby can be relied upon in trade. Good morning, everyone. Glad to have you with me, and thanks for sticking with me, which through a subject which to many people will seem obscure and unnecessary and far, far in the past, but it is the very, very beginning of our country. And Hamilton's ideas were the best available at the time, in my opinion. If you know of a way that the country could have survived without consolidating credit around a stable uh, dollar, then I'd love to know what it is. Franklin steps in. The day after Madison began his attack on Hamilton's credit plan, old Benjamin Franklin, in his last public act of his life, stepped in to clear the air of lying populist rhetoric. It ought to have been apparent to an honest observer that Madison and the Virginians behind him could not credibly represent the rights of the oppressed. Franklin's intervention with an anti-slavery petition completely stopped the debate over credit and brought Congress and the public face to face with the underlying reality. The Virginians who denounced debt slavery were the most vehement defenders of African slavery as a way of life and were the most radical opponents of economic development that would disturb it. The petition Franklin sent to Congress is described by the U.S. National Archives as, quote, asking for the abolition of slavery and an end to the slave trade. The petition asked the Congress to devise means for removing the inconsistency from the character of the American people and to, quote, promote mercy and justice toward the distressed race, unquote. The petition was introduced to the House on February 12th and to the Senate on February 15th, 1790. It was immediately denounced by pro-slavery congressmen and sparked a heated debate in both the House and the Senate. The Senate decided to take no action on the petition, and the House referred it to a select committee for further consideration. Debate then resumed on the Hamilton credit plan. Given Franklin's intervention, the hypocrisy of Hamilton's Virginia opponents as pretended defenders of the underclass could not have been lost on the Congress. On February 22nd, the House defeated Madison's amendment for discrimination among bondholders by a vote of 36 to 13. In March, Jefferson moved to New York to take his place in Washington's cabinet and to oversee the attack on the administration's program from the inside. Madison now blocked congressional passage of the other plank of Hamilton's plan, federal assumption of state debts. Compromise. The stalemate lasted for 3 months beyond Jefferson's arrival on the scene. The House passed the funding bill on June 2nd without the assumption measure. Finally, in late June, Jefferson hosted Hamilton and Madison at a dinner, and a deal was struck. Madison would let Congress pass assumption, and the administration would agree to place the permanent capital of the United States within slave-holding territory. Isn't that wild? What kind of a compromise is that? Where neither side gets anything, but they both agree to move on. In July 1790, the Residence Act established the sites of temporary U.S. capital, that is Philadelphia, until 1800, and of the permanent capital, Washington, D.C., thereafter. In August, the Complete Funding Act went into law. A week later, Congress authorized the Treasury Department to establish an armed service to enforce tariff laws, and the tariff rates were increased and extended to cover a large array of imports. The Compromise of 1790 on the location of the capital, together with the 3/5 slave representation compromise in the Constitution, set the stage for the South to exercise inordinate power over the federal government. Now, that's something that is worth pondering as well. Why did the first 5 presidents come from Virginia? Well, apparently, the people like Franklin and Hamilton thought that it was worth it to create a united country, even over their objections to the Southern plantation system. And so they proceeded. But these compromises also allowed the United States to begin to establish economic sovereignty. Hamilton pressed forward with the program through which industrial and social progress could occur, despite the power and hostility of the oligarchic enemy. The Bank of the United States. In December 1790, Hamilton proposed that a national bank be established to emit and stabilize a national currency and to handle government deposits. The Bank of the United States was to be privately owned so as not to be a partisan political instrument, but subject to executive and congressional oversight. Wouldn't that be nice to have actual oversight? Foreign stockholders were prohibited from voting their stock or serving on the bank board. The bank was to manage national finances so as to deliberately build up manufacturing and sustain useful commerce. As Hamilton put it, quote, by contributing to enlarge the mass of industrious and commercial enterprise, banks become nurseries of national wealth, unquote. Under Hamilton's leadership at the Treasury, the bank would counteract speculators and usurers whose actions, if unchecked, would always lead to general ruin. Its intended purpose, a successful future, was thus opposite to that of the Bank of England, which was set up to fund the monarch's interminable wars and to service parasitical imperial finance. Congress passed the Bank Act in early February 1791, over the objections of Southerners led by Madison. The Bank of the United States was to be located in Franklin's Philadelphia and would remain there even after the capital relocated to Washington. Philadelphia's revolutionary legacy and the national bank would continue to inspire the nationalist political tendency based there. Before President Washington officially received the bank law from Congress for his signature, he heard from Attorney General Randolph the opinion that the bank law was unconstitutional. This was the same Edmund Randolph who had warned Jefferson he must stay in public life so as to defend, quote, Southern interests, unquote. Washington then asked for Secretary of State Jefferson's opinion. Jefferson's reply to Washington says nothing about Hamilton's stated strategic aims for the bank as an instrument for national sovereignty and development, except in this remark, quote, I pass over the increase of circulating medium ascribed to the bank as a merit, and which, according to my ideas of paper money, is clearly a demerit. Jefferson says nothing about preferring, quote, Southern interests over national interests, which would not have been well received by George Washington. Against the convenience of having a national currency, he argues that having a single world currency would be even more convenient. But we have no power to create a bank for that purpose, and the world can do without it. His general argument is that a national bank is not specified in the U.S. Constitution and that the federal government must not be allowed to do things simply for the, quote, general welfare, unquote, of the population. The president solicited Hamilton's reply to Randolph's and Jefferson's written opinions. In his letter to Washington, Hamilton argues that the new government must be understood to have full authority to act on behalf of national sovereignty and national interests. He declares that, quote, principles of construction, that is, interpretation of the Constitution, like those espoused by the Secretary of State and the Attorney General, would be fatal to the just and indispensable authority of the United States. And interesting, he capitalizes United and States. Washington concurred with Hamilton, and on February 25, 1791, he signed the bill creating the Bank of the United States. Washington concurred, national credit was now solidly established. The debt was under control, import duties were set to service it, and an excise tax on distilled liquor was enacted in March 1791. The bank would supply an ample money circulation through a common national currency. Jefferson and his followers had not persuaded Washington, their fellow Virginian, to abandon his lifelong commitment to nation building. They now proceeded to create a political machine in opposition to Washington's administration, dedicated to continuing the status quo, a small economy of slave plantations and other rural producers, supplying raw materials to the former mother country in return for manufactures that backward America could not make for itself. Pardon me. Virginia's leading plantation families and their political representatives, together with similar, if slightly less lordly, anti-national interests in other southern states, provided the initial basis of this apparatus. The states of New York and Pennsylvania would have to be brought into play for an effective national challenge to the administration. Their relatively large populations carried weight in the balance of electoral and legislative power, and they were pivots of nationalism. Hamilton was the prime mover in New York. Franklin's deep legacy pervaded Pennsylvania's thinking, and Philadelphia was to be the national capital until the end of the 1790s. Burr, Gallatin, and the Shelburne apparatus. To quote, turn, unquote, these two states, Jefferson and Madison now began working in tandem with Aaron Burr in New York and Albert Gallatin in Pennsylvania. Burr had just become one of New York's senators, having defeated incumbent Senator Philip Schuyler, Hamilton's father in law. Gallatin, whom we have previously observed inciting opposition to the U.S. Constitution, was now a leading member of the Pennsylvania legislature, operating alongside Jefferson and Madison in the then state capital, Philadelphia. Burr and Gallatin would constitute the third and fourth leaders of the Jeffersonian Party that would drive the founding nationalists from power within a few years. Both Burr and Gallatin were personally affiliated with British intelligence apparatus, which Lord Shelburne operated from London and Geneva into France. Born in colonial New Jersey, Burr was a shockingly cynical lawyer and power broker, a political adventurer. He had been raised as a stepbrother to Peggy Shippen, who helped move her husband Benedict Arnold to his famous treason against the American Revolution. While Burr was a Continental Army officer in 1780, he had entered into an affair with Theodosia Prevost, whose husband, Mark Prevost, and his brother Augustine Prevost were then high officers in the enemy British Army. The Prevosts were members of a leading Geneva aristocratic family involved with combined British, Swiss political and financial interests all over Europe. When Mark Prevost died in 1782, Aaron Burr married his widow and adopted his children and soon served as attorney to the Prevost family interests in New York State. Theodosia introduced Burr to the work of Jeremy Bentham, Lord Shelburne's team leader for intrigue in France, whose degeneracy Burr more than mimicked. Albert Gallatin, as a student at the Academy of Geneva, formed a lifelong friendship with Etienne Dumont. Gallatin invited Dumont to participate in his Western Pennsylvania operations, but Dumont went instead into the service of Shelburne, an intermediary for the Bentham team's regime change intervention in France. Yeah, regime change intervention is exactly what the French Revolution was, and it was Britain behind it, as we've read. Gallatin was, from early childhood and throughout his life, intimately acquainted with the Mallet family of Geneva. That's Mallet. Professor Paul-Henri Mallet tutored Gallatin and directed his historical studies after having been commissioned by Lord Bute and George III to write the history of the British royal family. This professor's brother-in-law was British officer Mark Prevost, whose children Aaron Burr adopted. As Jefferson and Madison began in 1791 forming the national faction that was to become the Jefferson political party, or Jeffersonian, I should say, Senator Burr was shaping a New York State political machine that could deliver votes against Jefferson's opponents. Gallatin was meanwhile engineering a direct revolt against the federal government's fiscal program. On January 14, 1791, Gallatin introduced in the Pennsylvania Assembly a resolution saying, quote, the whiskey tax then pending before Congress was, quote, subversive of the peace, liberty, and rights of the citizen, unquote, and that through it the nation would enslave itself. During 1791, Jefferson founded a Philadelphia newspaper, the National Gazette, to attack Hamilton and his program. National Gazette editor Philippe Freneau was paid by Jefferson's State Department for a sinecure post as a translator. Sinecure meaning a permanent position with no actual duties. It should be noted that while this factional assault was being assembled, Shelburne's elder son, Lord Wycombe, that's Wycombe, was in the United States. Though Shelburne's son had just finished serving in his political eyes and ears in revolutionary France, he was on, quote, no political errand whatsoever in America, according to Shelburne's assurance to President Washington. The initial tactic of the political attack by Jefferson and his partners was to boldly lie against Hamilton rather than to debate his arguments. Hamilton was called a monarchist. They said his programs were deliberate designs to overthrow the republic. These slanders have echoed down through the centuries to the present era, adding a great deal to the stupefaction of Americans about their own history. Well, I could certainly want to see that written in bold and repeated. If we could get everybody to understand this view of Hamilton, which I perceive to be correct, then I think a lot of our nonsense opposition would disappear. The report on manufactures. President Washington had recommended to Congress the advancement of agriculture, commerce, and manufactures by all proper means. The House of Representatives then directed Treasury Secretary Hamilton, quote, to prepare and report to this House a proper plan or plans comfortably to the recommendation of the President for the encouragement and promotion of such manufactures as will tend to render the United States independent of other nations for essentials, particularly for military supplies. Wow, wasn't that interesting considering the DuPonts? Hamilton delivered his report on the subject of manufactures nearly 2 years later, on December 5th, 1791. Oh, I don't think that's 2 years later. All right, well. Okay, the resolution was passed January 15th, 1790, and then 2 years later, December 5th, 1791, is when Hamilton presents his report. The report ought to be considered one of the three great American founding documents, with the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. In a compelling proposal for action, it carries forward the sense of national mission of the most idealistic colonial settlers and revolutionary leaders. It sets forth the general program by which the United States would actually be industrialized, and in the following century, over the violent objections and the bloody and tragic delaying actions of the anti nationalists. Its outlines of what would be called the American system of economics would inform those activists far into the future in America and other nations who would fight successfully for mankind's right to progress. The report explains the advantages of an industrial developed economy and an intelligent, skilled, well paid population compared with a backward or merely rural society. It refutes British arguments against America deliberately industrializing itself. It outlines the means through which this transformation can succeed under the protection of the elected government. Hamilton insists that manufacturing is essential for national independence. Quote, not only the wealth, but the independence and security of a country appear to be materially connected with the prosperity of manufactures. Every nation, with a view toward these great objects, ought to endeavor to possess within itself all the essentials of national supply. These comprise the means of subsistence, habitation, clothing, and defense. The possession of these is necessary to the perfection of the body politic, to the safety as well as to the welfare of the society. The want of either and the want of an important organ of political life and motion, and in the various crises which await a state, it must severely feel the effects of any such deficiency. Space permits here only the briefest highlights of Hamilton's presentation. Hamilton paraphrases the arguments of British imperial strategists who warned that America must not develop itself through government protection and encouragement of industry. Hamilton directly answers them, cutting through the myth of free trade. The report sets forth the governmental measures that will lead to industrialization, prosperity, and national power. And now there's a number of bullet points which I will read. The first is, quote, protecting duties, that is, import taxes, on those foreign articles which are the rivals of the domestic ones, intended to be encouraged, unquote. The second one, bounties and premiums to be paid for important industrial innovations. Third, exemption of the raw materials used for manufactures from duty, that is, taxes. Fourth, the encouragement of new inventions by, quote, pecuniary rewards and for a time exclusive privileges, i.e., patents. Number five, judicious regulations for the inspection of manufactured commodities. And number six, making it simple and safe to transfer money and capital throughout the nation, as aided by a banking system whose purpose must be national development. And number seven, facilitating the transportation of commodities by government sponsorship of new canals and roads. Hamilton cites the recent outstanding infrastructure accomplishments in England, which we have described in Chapter 1. The report pays particular attention to the need to develop American coal mining, crucial for industrial fuel and for modern iron and steel production. It recollects the, quote, extreme embarrassments of the United States during the Revolution from an incapacity of supplying themselves, unquote. A country without industry could not provide adequate uniforms, shoes, or weapons for its own military. But if it were industrialized, it could defend itself and would in fact be independent in the modern world. Earlier in 1791, Hamilton had begun to create from scratch a model industrial city in New Jersey to demonstrate the industrial future that the country was planning. Now, I'm going to do something unusual for me, and that is to go and read the footnote because this is fascinating because of the location, and you'll hear it in a moment. It was called Paterson, after New Jersey Governor William Paterson, from whom Hamilton secured a charter for his Society for Useful Manufactures, initially exempting the town and its enterprises from state taxes. It would use the great falls of the Passaic River to turn the wheels, running the textile mills whose leading personnel were chosen by the Treasury Secretary. He commissioned Pierre Charles L'Enfant, who was then planning the national capital city, to design the canals conveying the water power to Paterson's machines. Paterson would later shift to iron and steel production and would supply a significant share of America's steam locomotives. Isn't that interesting? Paterson, New Jersey just happens to be the place where our Irish hero, John Philip Holland, when he immigrated, did his work to invent the submarine. The following year, Hamilton's family began building the Erie Canal to open up Western settlement and connect the frontier to the East Coast. His father-in-law, Philip Schuyler, started the project as a private enterprise, anticipating that government would subsidize or, as it happened, take over the project. The Great Canal would be built a quarter century later by the state of New York. The party system and the delay of American industrialization. Congress implemented most of the specific tariffs which Hamilton had proposed for various industries, but otherwise it took no legislative action in response to the report on manufactures as a whole, while Jefferson and Madison complained about the government pursuing unconstitutional objectives. Over the forthcoming years, they established a political party in opposition to the Washington administration, focusing on states' rights and free trade. Burr built the essential political machine in New York, which would ultimately link Wall Street with the slave South. Now, again, Wall Street and the slave South is a combination that, David Underdown has done some great work on this and a number of other people, but the idea that the slave South was a British institution and that Wall Street is essentially a extension of the British banking system gives us a huge understanding of the reason that we ended up having a civil war. And I've recently been reading the history of the Brown brothers and Harriman, Brown brothers Harriman. And if you look into the Brown brothers, well, they got filthy rich trading cotton through agents that they had all over the South. So, and then of course they are the great Wall Street Brown brothers Harriman firm connected intimately with London banks. A, uh, a revelation to most people who thought American history was what we learned in high school. Nope, it's not even close. Pardon me. Over the forthcoming years, they established a political party. All right, I already read that. Sorry. Burr built the essential political machine in New York, which would ultimately link Wall Street with the slave South. Gallatin, after playing a leading role in a riotous rebellion against the whiskey tax in Pennsylvania, went into Congress as the quote financial expert unquote to tear away at Hamilton's Treasury operations. Jefferson would resign from the cabinet in 1793, and Washington would never forgive him for instigating the political disaster that stifled the nation's plans at the outset. Ironically, as will be explained herein, it would be nationalist members of this Jeffersonian party who, a generation later, would revive Hamilton's whole program and carry out the first phase of America's industrialization. Washington and his Treasury Secretary faced a stark dilemma at the intersection of economics and foreign policy. Much of the young nation's external trade was with Britain, providing export income, revenue for the government from import duties, and products vitally needed until they could be manufactured in America. In 1793, Britain and France began a series of wars against each other lasting into the next century. Though Britain was a deadly enemy, still keeping military bases on the American frontier and arming Indians to attack Western settlers, the United States had to remain officially friendly to Britain and strictly neutral regarding the European war. Washington had to avoid any action giving Britain a plausible provocation to resume open war against its departed colonies. Jefferson publicly sided with the revolutionary France and set up democratic societies modeled on the Jacobins to press the attack on the administration. Honest nationalists, horrified by the French violence, rallied to Hamilton's defense, but a set of wealthy New England and New York merchants, linked financially to the British Empire, also now rose in action. Many of them had been on the British side during the American War for Independence. They condemned Jefferson's French sympathies, denouncing him as an infidel and atheist, demanding that the U.S. ally itself with Britain as a conservative policy course. With their strongest base in and around Boston, these Anglophiles formed an increasingly dominant force in the Federalist Party, opposed to Jefferson's Democratic-Republican Party. Chief Justice John Jay negotiated a treaty ratified in 1795 by which Britain agreed to withdraw its remaining troops from the U.S. Northwest Territory and allowing peaceful Anglo-American trade to proceed. The Jeffersonians called the Jay Treaty a sellout. The Washington-Hamilton neutrality policy was vital for America's security, but an element of honest patriots joined the Jeffersonian Party, believing that in abandoning France, America was dropping its Republican ideals and moving toward the alliance with Britain demanded by the wealthy Northern Anglophile Federalists. The case of Matthew Carey is instructive. Lafayette's gift of $400 allowed the exiled Irish patriot to begin as a Philadelphia publisher in the mid-1780s. Tench Coxe published his nationalist economic essay in Carey's nationalist international magazine, American Museum, a month after the essay was presented at Franklin's meeting and distributed to Constitutional Convention delegates. Coxe continued to write for Carey. From 1787 to 1789, Carey and his publishing enterprise worked in Hamilton's covert intelligence network. Through Hamilton's personal intelligence lieutenant Nathaniel Hazard and his brother, Continental Postmaster General Ebenezer Hazard, until the federal government had been safely established. In the new government, Carey's colleague Coxe was appointed as Hamilton's assistant Treasury Secretary and did prodigious work helping prepare Hamilton's report on manufactures. But Carey remained deeply involved with Ireland's resistance efforts against Britain. He was also a leading organizer of the community of new Irish immigrants who were bitterly anti-British. Potential French support had figured strongly in Irish hopes for national independence, and Carey, through the Irish lens, saw the American neutrality policy as a betrayal. Carey thus increasingly identified himself with the Jeffersonian opposition party, while continuing to advocate Hamiltonian nationalist economics. Coxe had gone over to Jefferson even before Carey. Matthew Carey became an important leader of Pennsylvania's Democratic-Republican Party. In years to come, he would join with Henry Clay and others in bringing various political groupings and individuals back to Hamilton's policies. When Washington declined to seek a third term in 1796, Hamilton helped draft Washington's farewell address, admonishing against entangling alliances or political attachments to European countries, and against following those who would split the Union, a warning to both parties. Out of office since 1795, Hamilton retained policy influence despite rancor between himself and the Federalist president, John Adams. An undeclared U.S. naval war with France in 1798 deepened factional warfare in the United States. The Federalist-controlled Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, allowing deportation of politically dangerous immigrants and imprisonment for criticizing the government. Do you think we're getting there again today, folks? In reaction, Jefferson and Madison crafted resolutions which were then passed by the Kentucky and Virginia legislatures, declaring that states had the right to nullify federal laws. Jefferson sought the presidency in 1800, with New York kingpin Burr as his vice presidential running mate. Hamilton wrote a private letter attacking the incumbent John Adams as incompetent. Its leak to the press led to Hamilton publishing it as a pamphlet, which split the Federalists and helped cause Adams's defeat. When Jefferson and Burr received an equal number of electoral votes, the choice fell to Congress. Burr double-crossed Jefferson and tried to snatch the presidency. Hamilton saw Jefferson as a deluded American, but he saw Burr as a criminal and potential dictator. Hamilton successfully moved Congress to select Jefferson, Burr having to settle for the vice presidency. Burr would kill Hamilton in a duel 4 years later after Hamilton caught him scheming with New England Federalists to break up the United States. President Jefferson chose as his Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin, the Geneva bred spokesman for the British imperial economic theory, free trade. Despite the successful establishment of nationalist institutions, their effectiveness was largely overwhelmed by the political disunion of the 1790s and by the austerity and anti industrial policies of the Jefferson administration. A real drive for industrialization could only come with a rebirth of broad public support for economic nationalism. And that concludes chapter 6 as well as the first section of the book. We are now up to page 155, and we'll stop reading there today. And let me take a moment to say hello to folks. We've got a few minutes left. Hello, Corky, and wow, mobsters here. You say Washington had a fair bit of personal debt to London lenders. Interesting. I didn't know that. Harry says history is all smoke and mirrors. Well, written history may be, but we persevere. We try to get the truth out. And I think that we can credit Anton Chaitkin with having tried to do that for his whole career. Um, a man that takes the time to write a book while he's in his uh, later years should be taken very seriously. And I take this work as a, a labor of love to try to help us see our way into the next decades. What Trenton makes, the world takes. Very good. The Gores are on it. I wonder, the Gore name is one it's hard to trace because they go back a long, long way. But when I was in Ireland, I became aware of an ascendancy family called the Gore-Booth family. You talk about something that piques my interest. It's to put Gore and Booth in the same name. So I studied that, and it turns out that this fellow Gore Booth was one of those large landowners in County Sligo of Ireland, a person who profited through the British mercantile system, the opium trading in particular. But he had a couple of daughters that became very, very active on behalf of the common people. One of them known as Countess Markowitz because she married a Polish count named Markowitz. And to mention her in Ireland today is to invite a conversation because she is still well loved and respected there for her work on behalf of the downtrodden and the poor and the victims of British policy. Mobster says Gores were on the Aran Islands. Well, they might have owned the Aran Islands, but I don't think they would have lived there. It's a pretty desolate place. But no, they had a good bit of Connemara, of which the Aran Islands are attached geographically. Yeah, I think Harry, you're absolutely right about that, and David Underdown has done great work to pursue that idea. I think that this is correct. Hello, Holly Ingle, and thank you for your blessings. And I wish everyone peace and love and healing, as we all need a lot of all of that, so that we can move forward and try to keep this country going on the right track, or at least steer it back the right way. All right. I think that's enough for this morning. I am still recovering from a little bronchitis, so you can maybe still hear that in the voice, although I think it's getting better. And I thank you all very, very much. I will be back tomorrow with the great Harley Schlanger right here at 11 a.m. I might schedule some special shows in the evening this week. I'm not sure yet. I feel like I'm getting behind on some things I want to do, and I've got to reschedule David Underdown, who I had to cancel last week. So we'll be seeing you a lot this week, I trust. Thanks again. Have a great afternoon.